I'm 31, and I'm realizing that the entire narrative of my childhood was built on a really elaborate, sweet-sounding lie that my dad kept up until he died last year. It's totally thrown me for a loop, and I don't even know who I am anymore. My dad, David, was the quintessential absent but loving figure. He worked overseas for a huge chunk of my formative years, moving between different engineering projects in places like Singapore and Dubai. Mom always explained it as him being a hero who was building a future for us, sacrificing his presence for our financial security. I bought it completely, and every time he was home, it was a celebratory, almost magical event. When I was about 8, before one of his longest stints away, he did this big dramatic thing. He presented me with a time capsule. It wasn't a dusty box. It was a beautifully engraved wooden chest he'd apparently spent hours on, telling me it held proof of his love and that I could only open it on my 18th birthday, no matter what. He said it was filled with his memories of me and letters he wanted me to read when I was an adult. It was his way of being there, even when he wasn't. I cherished that box. When my 18th birthday finally rolled around, I felt so mature and excited. I got the box, my mom crying happy tears as I did, and I opened it up. Inside, there were 20 letters, each dated for a specific year, from age 18 to 37. They were beautiful, filled with advice, pride, and stories about what he was doing and how much he missed me. There were also old report cards, a baby tooth, and a ticket stub from our one and only father-daughter camping trip. I cried so hard. That chest became the proof that his absence was purely logistical, not emotional. Now, 13 years later, I still have 9 letters left to open, and they've been a constant source of comfort after his passing. At least they were. This all changed last month. I was helping my mom finally clear out the attic, and we found an old forgotten duffel bag tucked away behind some Christmas decorations. It was my dad's, clearly marked with his initials, and Mom said she hadn't seen it since she unpacked his last trip home about 15 years ago. She tossed it to me, suggesting I check for anything sentimental. I unzipped the side pocket, and that's when my stomach dropped. Inside, wrapped in a worn t-shirt, was a set of engraving tools and a small leather-bound notebook. I opened the notebook, and what I found wasn't a journal, but a meticulously organized inventory of every single item in my time capsule, right down to the color of the ticket stub. But that wasn't the worst part. On the adjacent page, scrawled beneath the list, was a detailed, almost clinical writing schedule that outlined the themes and emotional tone for letters 1 through 20. It hit me like a physical blow. My hero, my absent but attentive father, didn't write those letters over 2 decades. He wrote them all at once, probably right before he gave me the chest when I was 8. The realization that my dad, David, had pre-written years of future correspondence in one go was initially just a massive shock. I closed the notebook, feeling physically sick, and put it back in the duffel bag, pretending I hadn't seen it. I just couldn't process it, especially because he was gone. Mom was busy downstairs, blissfully unaware, and I felt this sudden protective urge to hide what I'd found, like I was protecting his reputation more than my own feelings. But the seed of doubt was planted, and it started growing fast. I went back downstairs, my head spinning, and the first thing I did when I got home was pull out my time capsule. I opened the drawer where I keep the remaining 9 unopened letters, the ones intended to be read from age 23 to 31. I had just opened the one for my 31st birthday last month, 2 weeks after he passed, and it had been the perfect goodbye, a reflection on my career choice and a reminder to call my mother more often. It was uncanny how relevant it had always seemed. I picked up the envelope for my 27th birthday, which I had read 4 years ago. I remembered that letter vividly because it talked about how proud he was that I'd just moved into my own apartment in the city, and it contained a specific reference to an inside joke we had about my awful college roommate Sarah. I'd always assumed he must have gotten the update from my mom right before he wrote that one. But now, looking at the notebook's inventory, I saw the detailed notes for the 27th letter, which literally read, Theme, First Independent Living Riff on Sarah R. Joke. The problem? He had written that whole inventory and schedule when I was 8 years old. I didn't meet Sarah until I was 18, and I didn't move into that city apartment until I was 27. How could he have possibly included such specific future details a decade before they happened? My mind started racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe he had edited them over the years? But the wear and tear on the letters, the quality of the paper, everything felt like it had been sealed and untouched since I was a child. It suddenly dawned on me that the entire romantic narrative of the time capsule, him spending hours crafting these heartfelt updates from afar, was completely and utterly fake. There was something else going on, something deeper and much weirder than just a batch writing session. I spent the next 3 days in a complete fog, revisiting the details of the letters and the notebook. I kept coming back to that 27th birthday letter, the one where he mentioned my apartment move, and Sarah, the college roommate I couldn't stand. It was such a niche, specific detail, the kind of thing only someone very current in my life would know. I was trying to reconcile two impossible truths. The letters were sealed over 2 decades ago, yet they contained information from just a few years ago. I kept flipping through the leather notebook, and then I noticed something I hadn't before. The handwriting in the inventory list was Dad's, strong and blocky, but the tiny parenthetical notes next to the writing schedule for the later letters, the notes that contained those details, were written in a much finer, slightly looping script. It was almost like someone else was providing the color commentary. A horrible sinking feeling started in my stomach, one that made me feel like an utter fool. I pulled out one of the remaining unopened envelopes and held it up to the light, something I'd never done before out of reverence for the magic of the time capsule. The paper inside was thick, but I could just make out the shape of the folded letter. And then I saw it. Near the top edge, pressed faintly onto the paper, was a distinct indentation, like a pattern that had been embossed or stamped. It looked strangely familiar. I immediately drove back to my mom's house. I needed to see if the handwriting in the notebook matched anyone I knew, and I needed to investigate that weird little indentation. Mom was in the kitchen, and I casually asked her about the old duffel bag, mentioning I'd only found a few boring tools inside. She just shrugged and said, "Oh, those old things? Those were Lisa's before he married me, weren't they? He always kept them." Lisa, my dad's sister, my aunt. She lives across the country and has always been this slightly mysterious, eccentric figure who flew in for holidays and was always very, very private. As my mother said the name, I instantly remembered where I'd seen that indentation before. Aunt Lisa is a graphic designer and runs a tiny independent stationery shop. She custom makes her own paper, and she uses a subtle, unique blind embossment in the corner of all her products. That faint pattern on my letter? It was Aunt Lisa's shop logo. It had been staring me in the face all along. The realization about Aunt Lisa and her stationery logo felt like the final piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. It wasn't just my dad pre-writing the letters. It was a clear sign that someone else was involved, actively feeding specific, up-to-the-minute details into the time capsule long after the chest had been sealed. Dad wasn't a psychic. He had an accomplice. I knew I couldn't ask my mom. She had absolutely no idea about the duffel bag, the notebook, or the tools. Exposing this whole thing would destroy the beautiful, romanticized image of her late husband that she still clung to, the image Dad had meticulously created. So, I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone, and called Aunt Lisa. I started the conversation casually, asking about her business and how things were going. Then, I casually mentioned finding the duffel bag and the engraving tools. The line went silent for a beat too long. I pressed on, my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands, and I brought up the time capsule and how strange it was that the letters were so incredibly specific, especially the one about Sarah and my apartment. "Aunt Lisa," I finally asked, keeping my tone soft but firm, "did you help Dad with the letters? Did you write some of them?" What followed wasn't a denial or even immediate guilt, but this long, heavy sigh. She didn't try to lie, which was a huge relief, but also terrifying. She admitted that she wasn't just helping. She was the primary author of every letter after my 18th birthday. She explained that when Dad first made the chest, he truly intended to write them from abroad, but he realized quickly he couldn't maintain the emotional consistency while working 18-hour days in remote sites. More importantly, he needed to make the letters feel like he was present in my life, which he absolutely was not. She confessed that Dad would call her every few months, and she would act as his information broker. Mom was the unwitting source. Dad would pump Mom for details about my life. Mom would think he was just being a sweet, attentive husband, and then he'd relay those specific anecdotes to Lisa. Lisa, being a professional writer and having the right supplies, would then draft a beautiful sentimental letter on her custom stationery, date it for the future, and then mail it to Mom, who would then discreetly tuck it back into the chest during one of Dad's visits home. My mom thought she was participating in a sweet little ritual. I realized I was living inside a highly coordinated emotional performance. Aunt Lisa's confession was devastating, but it also flipped the script on every single assumption I had ever made about my dad. He hadn't just not written the letters, he had orchestrated a years-long charade to maintain an illusion of competence and devotion. But the part that really hurt was the motive she revealed. He wasn't always away for the engineering, she admitted quietly over the phone. Not after the first few years. She explained that after his initial contract overseas ended, Dad came home, but he quickly found that the high-pressure, high-salary lifestyle he'd become accustomed to wasn't available in our small town. Instead of admitting he couldn't find a comparable job, he started taking smaller, poorly paid consulting gigs far away, sometimes staying with friends or even crashing in cheap motels, just so he could maintain the illusion of the globe-trotting executive. The engineering projects overseas became a convenient and respectable cover story for his financial failures and his inability to adjust to a quieter life. He knew Mom and I idolized the man who was sacrificing everything for our future. He couldn't bear to let that image shatter. The time capsule wasn't a testament to his love. It was a preemptive emotional insurance policy. If the letters were good enough, if they contained just the right amount of specific detail, I would never question his absence or his priorities. He needed me to believe he was mentally and emotionally present, even when he was physically gone for reasons that were ultimately driven by shame and ego, not necessity. Aunt Lisa had gone along with it because she loved her brother and saw how much he needed this lifeline, how much he needed to be a hero in our eyes. But the sheer weight of her involvement, the knowledge that she and my dad had systematically lied to me and my mom for 2 decades, made my head spin. Every happy memory I had of reading those letters, every tear I shed, was now tainted by the knowledge that it was a scripted, coordinated performance. I hung up the phone feeling completely hollow, realizing that the man I mourned wasn't the man who had actually existed. After the call with Aunt Lisa, I felt this crippling sense of betrayal, not just from my dad, but from my aunt too, even though she genuinely believed she was helping him. I kept the secret, walking around my mom's house like I was a spy. I couldn't look at the engraved chest without feeling sick. I pulled out the remaining 4 unopened letters for my 32nd, 33rd, 34th, and 35th birthdays and just stared at them. They weren't from my dad. They were just more of Lisa's beautifully crafted fiction. I was tempted to burn them, to erase the final remnants of the lie. But something held me back. These letters represented the truth now, not the lie. They were proof of the elaborate scheme. I suddenly had this horrible thought. If Dad was going to this extreme length to cover up his absence and his financial struggles, what else was he hiding? His whole life was built on a structure of calculated deception. I went back up to the attic, found the duffel bag, and pulled out the leather notebook again. I looked at the handwriting, Dad's blocky script for the inventory, and Lisa's fine looping notes detailing the emotional themes. I flipped past the scheduled letters, past the report card's inventory, and came to the very back pages of the notebook, pages that were crumpled and obviously added later. These pages were written entirely in Dad's handwriting, but they were almost frantic, nothing like the neat inventory. They weren't about the time capsule at all. They were a detailed, obsessive list of payments and dates made to various anonymous bank accounts, all marked, confidential, do not disclose. The payments were small, but frequent, and stretched back over a decade. Next to the list, he had scrawled a note to himself that chilled me to the bone. This is the only way to keep them safe. The lie must continue. Don't tell M or my name. It's the price. It was clear these payments weren't just about covering up a failed career. They were about something much darker. He wasn't just hiding his joblessness. He was actively paying someone, or some entity, to keep a secret. The time capsule, I realized with crushing certainty, was only ever meant to secure my faith and keep me from asking the real difficult questions about where he really was and what he was running from. I focused on the anonymous accounts Dad had listed in the back of the notebook. They had random alphanumeric IDs, but the sheer regularity of the payments, always hitting on the 1st and 15th of the month, made them look like a payroll, or worse, hush money. I felt this overwhelming compulsion to find out who or what was on the receiving end. I used the dates and amounts to cross-reference them with the few actual bank statements my mom had kept from Dad's overseas projects. It took me 2 days of digging through ancient paper files in the basement, but I finally found a pattern. The money was being transferred from a specific holding company account in the Cayman Islands, an account I never knew existed, controlled solely by my father. That account was clearly not for his engineering income. It was a slush fund used only for these mysterious bi-monthly payments. Desperate, I went to his last known storage unit, a small one he'd kept since coming back from his last job. The lock was rusted, but Mom had the key. Inside, it was mostly junk, but tucked under a tarp was a heavy sealed manila envelope marked "Legal Files, to be opened only by my name." My hands were shaking so badly I almost tore the paper. Inside, there were a few documents. One was a copy of an old confidentiality agreement from 18 years ago, and my dad's signature was right next to the signature of a law firm I recognized as one that handles high-profile settlements. The agreement stated that in exchange for absolute permanent silence, an unnamed party was to receive a structured monthly payment. And then I saw the final document, a birth certificate. The name on it was wildly unfamiliar. A boy named Julian, born just a few months after I was. And under the field for father's name, bolded in capital letters, was David Michael, our last name. The anonymous payments, the shame-fueled absence, the time capsule lie to secure my loyalty. It all slammed together with crushing finality. My father hadn't been an absent hero working to build us a better future. He had been an absent cheat who spent half his working life and a small fortune paying off a woman to keep the secret of his second family and his illegitimate son hidden from my mother and me. He wasn't absent because he was building a skyscraper. He was absent because he was running a careful, decades-long double life. Staring at Julian's birth certificate dated 18 years ago, the entire world I thought I knew fractured. The realization wasn't just that my dad was a liar, it was that he had created a parallel life while pretending to be an international engineer. The time capsule wasn't a record of his love for me, it was the cost of his lie. He had to be gone so often to hide his second life, and the letters were the emotional smokescreen to keep me from questioning his absence. I finally understood the frantic notes in the back of the notebook. The monthly payments were the price for the mother of his second child to maintain her silence and keep Julian hidden. He had paid off a woman to secure his reputation and our family's peace. The man Mom and I mourned wasn't just a flawed husband and father. He was a meticulous deceiver. The last unopened letter, the one for my 35th birthday, sat on the table. It wasn't from Dad. It was from Aunt Lisa, full of beautiful customized sentiments based on information Mom had probably unknowingly provided. But now, I saw the truth etched in every carefully chosen word. It was a monument to his cowardice. He never had the courage to tell me the truth, instead choosing to live his life in 2-week cycles of guilt and secrecy. I never opened the remaining letters. I couldn't. They didn't represent my father's heart. They represented his hiding place. I ended up putting the entire chest, the fake report cards, the sentimental letters, the fake time capsule, back into the storage unit, right next to the duffel bag and Julian's birth certificate. I didn't tell my mom. I can't. Knowing the truth about David would destroy her in a way his death never could. I'm left with this immense, crushing burden of knowing that my entire relationship with my father was a beautifully constructed, decades-long hoax, and now I'm the sole keeper of the most devastating secret he ever created. Update. I did some quiet digging through old social media records, something Aunt Lisa helped me with reluctantly. I found the mother of his second child. Julian looks exactly like my dad. I haven't decided if I will contact them. I just keep thinking about the fact that those last 4 letters are still out there, waiting for me to read a lie written by my aunt, all to cover the existence of my half-brother who lives only 2 states away.